If your tomato plants look healthy but somehow the harvest never matches your expectations, there is a good chance you are making one of the same mistakes I used to make for years. The frustrating part is that these mistakes rarely kill a tomato plant. They do something much worse. They quietly steal fruit little by little until the season ends and you are left wondering where all those tomatoes were supposed to come from. I see it every year. A gardener waters regularly. The plants grow tall. The leaves look green enough. Flowers appear. Everything seems fine. Then harvest time comes and the baskets are only half as full as they should be. What surprises most people is that the problem often starts long before the first tomato even forms. Sometimes it begins with a simple decision made on planting day. Sometimes it comes from trying too hard to help the plant, and sometimes it comes from doing something that almost every gardening book tells you is a good idea. I learned this lesson the hard way after several disappointing seasons when my neighbors were harvesting buckets of tomatoes while my plants struggled through disease problems and poor fruit production. The difference was not expensive fertilizer. It was not special seeds. It was not some miracle product from a garden center. The difference came from correcting a few small mistakes that most gardeners never notice. One old gardener showed me something many years ago, and he said something I never forgot. He told me that tomatoes usually fail slowly before they fail visibly. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. Now, I see it every season. A plant starts losing strength weeks before any obvious symptoms appear. Lower leaves begin creating hidden problems. Nutrients become limited. Flowers drop. Heat stress builds. The harvest shrinks long before the gardener realizes anything is wrong. The good news is that every one of these problems can be fixed without spending much money and without adding complicated routines to your garden. In the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through 5 common mistakes that quietly reduce tomato harvests, and I will show you the simple changes that can completely transform the health of your plants. The first mistake is probably the most common one of all, and most gardeners do not even realize they are doing it until disease begins spreading through the lower part of the plant. The first mistake I want to talk about is something that looks harmless. In fact, many people leave it alone because they think more leaves automatically mean more tomatoes. I used to think the same way. I would let the plants grow however they wanted, and by the middle of summer the bottom of every tomato plant looked like a thick green jungle. At first, everything seemed healthy. Then, the problems started. A few yellow leaves appeared near the soil. A week later, there were brown spots. Not long after that, the disease began moving upward through the plant. What I eventually learned is that the lowest leaves are often the first source of trouble. They sit close to damp soil where water splashes after rain or watering. Every splash can throw fungal spores onto those leaves. Once infection starts, it spreads surprisingly fast. The plant then spends energy trying to keep damaged leaves alive instead of focusing on flowers and fruit. That is why one of the simplest habits I follow today is removing lower leaves as the plant grows. I do not strip the plant bare, and I do not remove large amounts at once. That is another mistake. I simply remove the leaves that are closest to the ground once the plant is established and producing strong growth. This improves airflow and allows sunlight to reach areas that were previously crowded and damp. The difference can be remarkable during humid weather. Many gardeners are surprised by how much healthier their plants stay when air can move freely around the lower stems. There is another benefit that few people talk about. When lower leaves are cleaned up properly, it becomes much easier to notice problems early. You can spot pests, you can see developing disease, you can check soil moisture more accurately. Everything becomes easier. An old gardener showed me this many years ago, and he said that tomatoes hate stagnant air almost as much as they hate drought. At the time, it sounded too simple to matter. Now, I never skip this step. But here is where many gardeners make the next mistake. After cleaning up the lower leaves, they assume the plant no longer needs much attention. The truth is that a tomato plant is one of the hungriest crops in the garden. And if you miss the next issue I'm about to discuss, Your plants may stay green and alive while quietly producing far fewer tomatoes than they should. The second mistake is one that fools a lot of gardeners because the plants often look healthy for quite a while. The mistake is assuming tomatoes can grow all season on whatever nutrients happen to be in the soil when they were planted. I understand why people think that way. You prepare the bed, you add compost, you plant healthy seedlings. Everything takes off beautifully. For a few weeks, the plant seems strong and full of energy. Then something changes. Flower clusters become smaller. New growth slows down. Some flowers fall before they can develop fruit. The tomatoes that do form stay smaller than expected. Many people blame the weather. Sometimes they blame the seed variety. But very often the real problem is that the plant is simply running low on fuel. Tomatoes are heavy feeders. Once they begin producing flowers and fruit, they are working incredibly hard. Every tomato that develops requires nutrients. Every new flower cluster requires nutrients. Every healthy leaf requires nutrients. If those nutrients are not available consistently, the plant starts making choices. It may keep growing leaves while reducing fruit production. It may drop blossoms to conserve energy. It may produce fewer tomatoes overall. Years ago, an older gardener taught me a simple rule that I still follow today. He told me never to let a tomato plant get hungry. Not starving, not struggling, not waiting until problems appear. He fed his plants lightly but regularly throughout the season, and his harvests were always impressive. That lesson changed the way I garden. Today, I use simple feeding methods. Sometimes compost tea, sometimes a balanced fertilizer, sometimes well-aged compost around the base of the plants. The exact product matters less than consistency. Small, regular feedings often work much better than one large feeding every few months. There is another trap here that catches many gardeners: too much nitrogen. When people see slow growth, they often add strong fertilizers designed to create lush green leaves. The result can be beautiful plants with very few tomatoes. The plant becomes focused on producing foliage instead of fruit. That is why balance matters. You want healthy growth, but you also want steady flower and fruit production. Most gardeners make this mistake without realizing it. They see lots of green leaves and assume everything is going well. Then harvest season arrives and the baskets are disappointingly light. But even gardeners who feed properly can accidentally reduce their harvest through another common mistake. In fact, this next one often happens because people are trying too hard to help their tomato plants grow better, and it can quietly remove a large part of the future harvest before anyone notices. The third mistake is probably the most misunderstood one on this list, because it comes from advice that is partly true. You have probably heard that tomato suckers should be removed. That advice is everywhere. And yes, some pruning can be helpful. The problem begins when gardeners become too aggressive. I see people removing sucker after sucker until the plant looks almost stripped down. They believe they are helping the plant focus its energy. What often happens instead is that they remove future production without realizing it. Every sucker has the potential to become a branch. Every branch can produce flowers. Every flower cluster can become tomatoes. When too many suckers are removed, the plant loses a significant amount of its fruit-producing potential. Years ago, I made this exact mistake. I spent hours carefully pruning every new shoot I could find. My plants looked neat and organized. I was proud of them. Then harvest season arrived and something was missing. The plants were healthy, but they simply were not carrying the number of tomatoes I expected. Meanwhile, a neighbor who barely pruned at all was harvesting basket after basket. That got my attention. An older gardener later explained it to me in a way that made perfect sense. He said pruning should solve problems, not create them. If branches are crowded and blocking airflow, then remove some. If growth is so dense that disease becomes likely, then thin it out. But if a healthy branch has room to grow and receive sunlight, it can become part of your harvest. That simple advice completely changed the way I handle tomato plants. Today, I remove damaged growth. I remove weak growth. I remove branches that are causing serious crowding. But I no longer treat every sucker like an enemy. Many gardeners are shocked by how much more productive their plants become when they stop over-pruning. Another thing few people mention is that leaves are not just decoration. They are the plant's energy factories. Every healthy leaf captures sunlight and helps create the energy needed for flowers and fruit. When too much foliage disappears, the plant loses part of its ability to support a heavy harvest. Balance is the key. Enough pruning to maintain airflow and plant health, but not so much that you remove the plant's ability to produce. Most people are surprised when they discover how much yield they have been cutting away with their own hands. And while pruning mistakes can reduce harvest dramatically, there's another mistake that begins long before the plants start growing. In fact, this next one happens on planting day and can affect the entire season from the very beginning. The fourth mistake happens before the season really begins, and yet it can affect everything that follows. I am talking about planting tomatoes at the wrong time. Most often the problem is planting too early. After a long winter, many gardeners become excited the moment they see a few warm days. The seedlings are ready. The garden looks ready. The forecast seems encouraging. So the tomatoes go into the ground. Then a cold night arrives. Maybe not a frost, just a stretch of cool temperatures. The plants survive, but they never seem quite as strong afterward. Growth slows. Roots develop more slowly. Flower production gets delayed. The harvest starts later and often remains smaller throughout the season. I learned this lesson after several years of rushing my tomatoes into the garden. Every spring I was determined to get a head start. Every spring I ended up fighting weak growth for weeks. One year, an older gardener watched me planting and simply smiled. He told me that tomatoes do not care how impatient we are. They care about warm soil and stable temperatures. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Later, I realized he was absolutely right. Tomatoes are heat-loving plants. They want warmth both above and below the ground. When the soil is still cool, the roots cannot work efficiently. Nutrients become harder to absorb. Growth becomes sluggish. Even though the plants remain alive, they lose valuable momentum. That lost momentum often follows them for the rest of the season. Today, I wait until conditions are truly favorable. Not just one warm afternoon, but a reliable pattern of warm days and mild nights. The difference is remarkable. The plants establish faster. New growth appears sooner. Flower clusters develop earlier and more consistently. It actually feels like the plants are eager to grow rather than struggling to survive. There is another side to this mistake that many gardeners overlook. Planting too late can also reduce yields because the plants lose valuable growing time before summer arrives. That is why timing matters. Not too early and not too late. Just when the conditions are right. Most people focus on fertilizers and watering schedules while ignoring this simple decision that can shape the entire season. But even perfectly timed planting cannot protect tomatoes from the final mistake on this list. In recent years, this problem has become much more common, and it can cause flowers to drop and fruit production to slow dramatically, even when everything else has been done correctly. That mistake arrives during the hottest part of summer, and many gardeners do not recognize it until harvest numbers begin falling. The fifth and final mistake, is one that has become much more common in recent years, and it can quietly destroy a tomato harvest even when everything else is done correctly. The mistake is ignoring extreme summer heat. Many gardeners worry about cold weather in spring, but forget that tomatoes can also struggle when temperatures climb too high. I have seen beautiful healthy plants covered in flowers one week and then producing almost no new fruit the next. The plants looked fine from a distance. The leaves were green. The stems were strong. Yet something had changed. The flowers were dropping before fruit could form. That is when I learned how sensitive tomatoes can be during periods of intense heat. When daytime temperatures stay very high and warm, nights offer little relief, the plants begin protecting themselves. Instead of focusing on fruit production, they concentrate on survival. Pollination becomes less successful. Flowers fall. New tomatoes fail to develop. Many gardeners think they have a fertilizer problem when the real issue is heat stress. An old gardener showed me a simple solution years ago. He said that during the hottest weeks of summer, tomatoes sometimes need a little protection, just like people do. That advice sounded strange at first, but it works. Today, when extreme heat arrives, I make sure the plants are deeply watered and mulched. A good layer of mulch helps keep the soil cooler and prevents moisture from disappearing too quickly. In especially hot conditions, some gardeners even use light shade cloth during the hottest afternoon hours. You do not need to create deep shade. Tomatoes still need sunlight. The goal is simply to reduce the harshest stress during the most intense part of the day. Another thing I watch carefully is watering consistency. Heat and drought together can place enormous pressure on a plant. Deep watering allows the roots to stay active and helps the plant continue supporting flowers and developing fruit. The difference can be surprisingly noticeable. Plants that receive steady moisture during heat waves often continue producing, while stressed plants slow down dramatically. When I look back over the years, I realize that most disappointing tomato harvests were not caused by one huge mistake. They were caused by several small mistakes working together. Lower leaves creating disease problems, plants running short of nutrients, excessive pruning, poor planting timing, heat stress during summer. Fixing these issues one by one completely changed the results in my garden. And what happened after I corrected them all surprised even me, because the improvement was far greater than I expected, and it changed the way I grow tomatoes every season. When I finally understood these 5 mistakes and started correcting them consistently, the difference in my garden was impossible to ignore. The plants stayed healthier longer. The leaves remained greener. The flowering period lasted longer. Most importantly, the harvest baskets became noticeably heavier. What I like most about these changes is that none of them require expensive products or complicated systems. You do not need special equipment. You do not need to spend hours every day in the garden. Most of these improvements come from paying attention to a few simple details that many gardeners overlook. Removing lower leaves helps prevent disease before it starts. Regular feeding keeps plants productive through the entire season. Sensible pruning protects future harvests instead of removing them. Proper planting timing gives tomatoes the strong start they need, and protecting plants during extreme summer heat helps them continue producing when conditions become difficult. None of these ideas are new. In fact, many of them were shown to me by gardeners who learned them decades ago. They did not have shelves full of products promising miracle results. They relied on observation and simple habits repeated year after year. That is one reason I still trust these methods today. They have worked across many seasons and many different weather conditions. If you are struggling with tomato production, I would encourage you not to change everything at once. Start with one mistake. Correct it. Watch what happens. Then move to the next. Small improvements have a way of building on each other. Before long, the plants begin responding differently. You notice stronger growth, more flowers, better fruit set, fewer problems. Gardening often works that way. Small decisions made consistently create results that seem surprisingly large by the end of the season. I still remember the first year when I applied all of these lessons together. Walking through the garden felt completely different. Instead of worrying about disease and poor production, I was thinking about what to do with all the extra tomatoes. There were enough for fresh eating, enough for sauces, enough to share with neighbors. That is the kind of season every gardener hopes for. And the best part is that these same simple changes can start working in your garden immediately. The next time you walk out to your tomato plants, take a closer look. One of these 5 mistakes may already be quietly limiting your harvest. And once you see it, you can begin fixing it. Sometimes the biggest harvests come not from doing more, but from stopping the few things that have been holding the plants back all along. And there is one more old tomato growing habit that many gardeners still overlook today that can make an even bigger difference next season.